Many Americans know that the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, abolished slavery. A lesser-known fact, however, is that the text contained a loophole. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would be permitted, except as punishment for a crime. So, while people often refer to slavery as a relic of the nation's past, this isn't the whole story. While the hereditary, race-based chattel slavery system ended, involuntary servitude persisted. As singer, songwriter, and activist Nina Simone once said, "Slavery has never been abolished from America's way of thinking." The tradition of forced labor continued. Some states, such as Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont, voted for ballot initiatives to remove slavery loopholes in recent years. Yet, Louisiana and California voters retained the provision. Thus, if the nation wants to place the legacy of slavery in the rearview mirror, citizens must first support a federal solution. And the exception, a coalition of 80 organizations has proposed an abolition amendment to close the loophole, noting that incarcerated people who refuse to work are often beaten, denied contact with family, put in solitary confinement, and even denied parole, punishments that date back to antebellum slavery. In states like Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, prisons are not required to pay workers anything. Even in states where incarcerated people are paid, their wages are very low, an average of 86 cents per day. According to a 2023 complaint from workers at Angola Prison in Louisiana, a former plantation, they are not eligible for pay during their first 3 years working the farm line, and after that, may only be paid 2 cents per hour. While some scholars contend that a low wage is better than no wage, and hence is not reflective of slavery, these arguments neglect to consider the essence of slavery rooted in the prison economy, through the fiscal motivations of compulsory labor for profit. Liliana Falcone wrote in the Harvard Undergraduate Law Review, "Since prisons are primarily dependent upon labor, and the law strips incarcerated workers of their rights, they're left vulnerable to exploitation. The fact that some states permit forced labor as a punishment for a crime reveals something chilling about America, that slavery will persist in this nation to the degree to which the law and the public permit it." The 13th Amendment was essential as it granted a layer of permanence to the freedom black people obtained from race-based hereditary chattel slavery. And yet the loophole rendered the journey toward abolition incomplete. After the Civil War, white-controlled state governments passed a series of black codes, new laws they used to justify stripping black people of their freedom. For instance, one Mississippi law required residents to carry proof of employment for the current year. Those caught not working could be arrested and forced to work. As Michelle Alexander wrote in The New Jim Crow, 9 Southern states adopted vagrancy laws following the Civil War, which essentially made it a criminal offense not to work and were applied selectively to blacks. Under this system, prisoners were forced to work for little or no pay. The for-profit prisons in the modern-day era that exploit the 13th Amendment loophole are following a very old script. Depriving one group of the same freedoms afforded to others has always required justification. While chattel slavery was predicated upon the myth of African inferiority, the newer system of involuntary servitude has been justified by stigmatizing black people and other racial groups as more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Hence, efforts during Jim Crow to move the goalpost regarding criminality. As Khalil Gibran Muhammad, a professor of history, race, and public policy, noted, mass criminalization first awaited mass freedom for African Americans. Seemingly overnight, scenes of sheriff's auctions replaced slave auctions. The problem is some don't see mass incarceration and forced labor as a grave injustice. Convincing the public those who violate social norms should be deprived of their human rights has dampened resistance. It explains why, 160 years after the Civil War, America has yet to ban involuntary servitude. Black Americans were imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white Americans in 2021. Thus, not only are some prisons forcing incarcerated people to labor for little or no pay, but this is happening disproportionately to black people. When we consider that black people are roughly 7.5 times more likely than white people to be wrongfully convicted of murder, the injustice of the system is laid bare. The bitter reality is that the system doesn't reliably tell us who is or isn't guilty. And of course, the irony shouldn't be lost on Americans that President-elect Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felonies in a hush money case. His ascension to the highest seat of political power, regardless of criminal convictions, highlights the absurdity of condemning citizens convicted of a crime to forced labor. As a white, wealthy man, Trump will never likely harvest crops for pennies a day as many black felons do. Racism taints the criminal justice system to such a degree that the outcomes more accurately reflect someone's station in life rather than the merits of their character. Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley introduced S.J.Res. 33, an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to prohibit the use of slavery and involuntary servitude as a punishment for a crime. It currently has 16 co-sponsors. Until that law, or a similarly worded one, is passed, the injustices inflicted upon incarcerated people will not end. As the abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them, and these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both." One of the most prominent myths about slavery is that it exists only as a historical stain upon the nation's consciousness. Not only does this framing obscure the modern-day impact of chattel slavery, but it also overlooks the loophole that still permits forced labor. The 13th Amendment left enough wiggle room for involuntary servitude to persist. To mitigate that problem, Americans must support a federal abolition amendment. However, to gain enough public support, more people would need to see through the justification of criminality, just as the abolitionists of the 1800s saw through the myth of African inferiority. This article is shared from media sources to enrich public dialogue and encourage thoughtful discussion.